Welcome everyone to this live session where Jill has very kindly offered to join us to discuss environmental risk assessments. So for any of you joining for the first time, please make sure you watch on Vimeo because that's the best way to be able to interact with us and ask us questions so that Jill can answer any questions you may have about environmental risk assessments and how they interrelate with process safety. Just remember that anything on the chat and anything you say here will be able to be seen live on YouTube and Facebook. So just be mindful about what you talk about. Say hello to us on the chat. Let us know where you're from. And thank you very much for joining us. So as you know, I'm Louise Whiting and I run these sessions every week. I have about 11 years experience with major operators, and we're running these sessions as an opportunity for you to get help in where you need them. So Jill has joined us today, so I'm going to hand over to Jill to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm having a bit of a problem hearing you actually, Louise, so I hope everybody can hear me fine. So I'm Jill Butler. I'm an environmental engineer and I've worked in the oil and gas industry onshore and offshore for 20 years. And of course, within that time, I've spent a lot of experiences with the safety case and the environmental section of COMA. So I'm just kind of bringing that experience today to talk about quantitative environmental risk assessment.
So Jill, let's just do another check. Can you hear me okay now?
It's a little bit patchy for me.
Can anybody let us know via the chat if you can hear me and you can hear Jill? I haven't had any feedback through the chat. So I'm going to hand over. So this is Rajiv. Can you let us know if you can hear us okay? You can hear us both. So maybe it's just on your end, Jill. I'm going to pass over to Jill in a moment just to do her presentation. But I just wanted to thank everyone for attending, and I really hope that the session goes really well and that you get what you want from asking Jill and having this opportunity to ask her questions about environmental risk assessments, which are becoming a lot more popular with the regulators in different areas.
Okay, thanks, Louise. So today I'm talking about environmental risk, and more specifically, how we apply quantitative risk assessment techniques to environmental events. The first thing, I just wanted to recap what the working definition of environmental risk. So it's the actual or potential threat of adverse effects on living organisms and the environment by effluents, emissions, waste, resource depletion, arising from an organization's activities. So the model that we're considering here is called the source pathway receptor, the source being the initiating hazard, and the pathway depends on how that hazard comes to fruition and also how it reaches the receptor. In this case then, terrestrial, freshwater, marine and groundwater environments. Often when people are trained in safety risk assessment, it takes some time to get the head around, identify and understand the key differences between that and environmental risk. So remember from the previous slide, the definitions include actual rather than just potential effects. So in safety, you very rarely, if ever, manage a hazard that's knowingly going to expose a person to harm. But if you consider the discharge of effluent runoff or even atmospheric emissions, we actually plan to cause harm to the environment. The other key differences are that this is very much consequence driven. Now, I understand the same can be said for major accident hazard analysis, but in my experience, there's very little regard paid to actual environmental risk. Rather, it could happen without any consideration of likelihood or frequency of event. Now, I always say that environmental culture and management is around 15 to 20 years behind safety. If we consider it took Piper Alpha in 1988 to get us where we are now with safety cases and a risk-based approach. You could consider that Deepwater Horizon event of 2010 is the environmental equivalent, and we haven't yet seen the positive impact of those lessons learned. So we still apply across the board approach, which might not always be fit for purpose. Now, environmental engineers rely heavily on the tools, assessment techniques within an environmental management system. The science, I don't think, is developed sufficiently to the extent of process safety that we have the assessments and studies to actually make our point. Now, because the environment is highly variable, we don't use definitive words. So we say things like significant adverse effects, because populations, species, and ecosystems are impacted in so many different ways and recover at different rates that this can't be fixed. And of course, we can't put a price on the environment like we can for, say, a broken leg, because once a species is gone, it's gone forever. However, ecosystems are highly resilient. Now, in the last 10 years, as Louise mentioned, we have seen evidence that reputational damage of an environmental event can sometimes exceed the reputational impact of a similar scale safety incident. It is growing in, I think popularity is the wrong word, but operators now insist on having a robust risk assessment for anything that they do from an environmental perspective. For today, I'm just going to be considering what we call major events. So MEIs, major environmental incidents, or MATIs, major accidents to the environment. Firstly, when we have to consider the major events. Now, this list here might not apply to all sites, but I haven't ever identified any that don't fit into one of these categories. Firstly, you're looking at significant static inventories at your site, either chemical or oil, but do consider the actual chemistry through the safety data sheets. If you've got a catastrophic offshore platform failure, of course, all of that is going to end up in the sea. The effect of a pipeline rupture is going to depend on its inventory and isolatable sections. And when we consider a well blowout, we must think about worst case scenario, and that could be several months before the well is capped. So you'll see then, we have the data for a safety QRA, we know the volumes, we understand the isolatable sections, we know what is a credible event. Itself in the environment. If you had a fire and explosion on site, your people would likely die from burns, asphyxiation, or an impact injury. But in the environment, there is a range of receptors and their pathways are all different. Now, of course, we're very aware of oiled birds like this one in the picture. And at this stage, birds who had been impacted like that would most likely die. But we also have to consider what we call sublethal oiling of feathers, which has longer term impacts. It doesn't immediately kill the bird, but it might poison them during preening, or the chicks could be exposed and die from that, which reduces the reproductive capability of the adult. Similarly, if you have a chemical release that contaminates the water column, the primary food source, for instance, these fish, could be killed, and therefore we have another sublethal impact effect on the bird. In terms of receptor, I'm using an offshore example today. Now, for these major events, we have to consider the impacts at ecosystem or species level, so not individual. So this map of the northern North Sea, all these different coloured in areas are protected sites. So they're protected for species like bottlenose dolphin in this area here, or for habitat features such as sandbanks, which you get off the east coast down there. About 5% damage to a habitat or a population is because that is what we understand the tipping point to be, when the overall population or ecosystem will start to show detrimental effects. Now, in the UK, and I assume in other parts of the world, we have publicly available records which show seasonal sensitivities and distributions of organisms. We know then that in certain months, birds are highly sensitive to a spill because they're flightless, having just shed their winter feathers. We know in the summer months, we have planktonic blooms in the water column, We know seals gather in certain areas in seasons, so their sensitivity increases in that area in those months. But as you can imagine, because you're dealing with animals here, the receptor is always a moving target. In a site-based QRA, you know, if you've got a workshop mechanic, for instance, that they will spend maybe 80% of their exposure hours in the workshop. Without the modeling and sensitivity analysis that I'm talking about here, we have no idea where and what is in the environment and how we can predict the impact. So I've called this section then probability of impairment. We must consider the probability that an organism is in an area and the seasonal sensitivities. The image shows two environmental modelling techniques which inform our hazard analysis. The right-hand side is an oil spill model. So this arrow here takes you to a protected site. So this, the spill model is overlaid in GIS with the North Sea. UK is over here. So in this protected site here, we know that there's a 45% chance that in the event of this particular release, surface oil will be in that area at 0.1 microns. And 0.1 microns is the surface thickness that we know will impact birds. So we are concerned when we find 45% probability of 0.1 microns in that area. If we look at the left image here, this is a slightly different type of modelling, and we can see what the water and sediment contamination looks like. So this is under the surface of the spill. This cross section here tells us how far down in the water column the impact from the surface spill will reach. Then we can understand, will it affect the plankton in the water column, and actually does it go into the sediments and affect the benthic organisms that live down there? We understand what fatal doses are for key groups, so we know the probability then that, say, a 5 ppm contamination of oil will have a lethal effect on a particular species of fish or a group of plankton. And this is where the clever bit comes in. So this is where the EQRA starts. In step 1, we know we have a significant inventory, but could it actually reach the sites and the species we're concerned with? Will it cover a big enough area? And that's why we look to spill modelling. Then when we consider step 2, we look at how the release will impact the receptor. So is it surface coverage? Is it in the water column? Is it in the sediments? Is it a sensitive time period? And are organisms there in significant numbers? And here it is. This table up here tells us the frequency of 5 credible events. So leak from the major export pipeline, well blowout platform and subsea, structural failure, and ship collision. If we look at the pie chart here, it shows us that the biggest risk of a major environmental incident comes from well blowout, followed by ship collision. So we know to focus controls on these key scenarios. And then when I introduce that map back of the northern impacted sites, so each of these in this list here relates to one of these coloured areas there. Only some of these protected sites will be impacted by some major environmental incidents. And the one that I've highlighted here is called Buck and Ness. That's right on the coast. So when we consider a spill from the Pink Star, from a platform there, Buck and Ness is the nearest protected site that spill will reach. And so you would expect that site to have the highest frequency of impact. So based on the fact that a release from all 5 of those MEI scenarios has the potential to reach this site and cause significant damage because it's on the coast and the ecosystem provides access to the various pathways to impact the receptors. So we therefore know where to focus our attention. Now, if you've ever been involved with environmental management, you will know that qualitative assessment is largely based on guesswork. And I've certainly been on the receiving end of many process engineers who struggle with this apparent guesswork approach. Based on a set of documented assumptions, and by using this EQRA approach, we are able to rely on robust calculations and proven scientific data sets that accurately predict the risk profile and make effective allowance for remediation in the event of a major release. And that's me.
So thanks very much, Jill, for going through that. It's really interesting to see this new approach with the quantitative assessment. Can you hear me okay?
Not really.
Okay, let's try. Oh no, Rajiv can't hear me. Can you hear me now?
It just sounds a bit tinny.
Can you hear me enough to make it out?
Yes, I can try and make a question, yeah.
I've also seen the resistance with engineers with the more qualitative assessments on process safety. How often have you used this quantitative assessment, and do you have any feedback about the relative time it takes between the quantitative and the qualitative?
Yeah, so I mean, given the number of scenarios that we analysed here, and this particular operator had 3 major platforms in the North Sea, it did take a significant amount of work. What actually took longer was writing the standard to try and understand the legal requirements that they introduced into the UK regulatory framework in 2015. So because the words were things like significant adverse effects, it took a long time to try and put a framework together and understand what the expectation of the regulator was. They didn't make any alignment between the offshore requirements and established guidelines in CDOI for coma, for instance. So it probably took longer than expected to get to a place where we had the model designed and the assumptions in place. The rest of it is just kind of number crunching to produce the models. I wouldn't certainly do that for any kind of environmental aspects assessment, or unless it was a major project. To date, I've used this for safety case submissions and coma.
So from a process safety perspective, this is very similar to what we have to do. We have to make sure that it's very clearly defined what the consequences are on the receptors, and sometimes that's the thing that takes the longest, is defining what the consequences are on the receptors. What sort of modeling software do you use for these environmental consequences?
So those 2 pieces of software that I showed in a screenshot. So one is it's called Oscar modeling, which shows you the extent of a spill, and then the other one is called DREAM, and it's the DREAM model that we look at the consequence analysis from. But before that, I spent a lot of time researching what, for instance, is the lethal dose for a particular kind of fish, what ppm will take out a significant proportion of the plankton population, how exactly are whales, dolphins and seals impacted, what is the film thickness on the sea surface that's going to impact them. So it was quite scientific and environmental, quite frankly. A lot of biology went into putting those assumptions together. The modelling is just the final part to see where your event sits in your kind of scale of lethal and sublethal impact.
So Rajiv has given us a question, which is, what are the regulations which mandate environmental QRA? Are there any in the UK at the moment, and do you know any about any other areas?
No, there are none. the regulations tell us that we have to assess our impacts on the environment, and we have to prove that as an operator that we could meet our liabilities in the event of a major release. Now, when I worked at the operator to build this model, I was in the process safety department, and we could not understand how we could deliver some kind of liability estimation without fully understanding a detailed risk profile of the major events. So no, there's no regulation, there's no requirement, but we can't understand how you can meet the regulation without a model such as this.
So the example that you gave us was based on like a liquid-liquid dispersion. What type of modeling would you use for a gas dispersion, and which type of sort of pollutants would you be looking at there specifically for some of the sensitive populations?
So we don't consider a gas release to be a major environmental incident. So that is not considered in a safety case type of setup. So we don't model that from an environmental perspective. The models that I showed you there are for varying types of oil, and you put in API information from the specific field, and then any range of chemicals can go into that.
Okay.
Also, the other information that's fed into it is the sediment type in a particular area, and of course the water temperature, current information.
Oh, okay. So, and then does the shipping activity and the activity in the area also impact the dispersion?
That we didn't consider that in those dispersions, but when you're doing other kinds of quantitative risk assessment for chemical use and discharge in normal operating conditions, that does consider other users. Yeah.
And the environmental major incidents that you mentioned, are they typically also process safety major accidents or major incidents, and then only a subset of that are the environmental ones? Is that typically what you've seen?
So the two sets of legislation for COMA, you will sometimes get additional MATIs in addition to the major accidents for an onshore site. However, the offshore UK safety case regulations, you can only have an MEI if it is a consequence of a major accident hazard.
Okay. And is that because of the nature of the releases and the locations of the receptors?
It's just the way that they wrote the legislation. We really couldn't think of a scenario that would lead to a major environmental incident that wasn't already a major accident hazard, unless it was a subsea well, a significant distance from the platform. And there wouldn't be a potential loss of life from that.
And so I suppose the thing, as you mentioned on the presentation, environmental risks are quite heavily dependent on your location. So you could have two identical platforms located at different locations, and their environmental major accidents or incidents would be completely different. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So not only is it geographically biased, but also seasonally. So you have something happen in the middle of summer versus the middle of winter, the impact will be significantly different those 6 months apart. And it just all adds to the complexity, which I hope I conveyed in the risk assessment process.
And so when I'm doing a process safety risk assessment and I put in mitigations, my mitigations are generally the same throughout the year. With environmental risk assessments, I'm getting the feeling that that's not going to be the case. You may take additional measures during certain times.
Well, you typically don't. It's more about the recovery, because given that major environmental incidents are largely aligned with major accident hazards, you're probably doing everything you possibly can to stop them from happening in the first place. The time we have any kind of contradiction is, from a safety perspective, you want to get an inventory from people as quickly as possible. Or, of course, environmentally, we don't necessarily want to put it in the sea. But we don't do anything different in terms of control and mitigation at a work site from different times of the year, from what I have seen. It's an understanding that it could happen and it could have a different impact.
So when I worked in Norway, we were doing the construction for the landing for an onshore pipeline, and there was a special species, I think, of penguins or seals. I cannot remember exactly, but they nested during a certain period of the year, and actually everything that happened close to shore had to stop for that period of the year so that they could allow them to nest, etc. And then they hadn't even introduced the hydrocarbons or anything at that point. We were just managing environmental risk, which was unrelated to operating facility. So I suppose it really depends on your situation. And when you're doing the environmental risk assessment.
I mean, I was working on commissioning the gas terminal on the Shetland Islands, and there was a lot of protected birds there. And the minute that any of those birds found themselves on the site, then the construction work just stopped. And it did have a significant impact on the progress of the site. So yes, the seasonality does help. You might also consider if you were decommissioning, for instance, you might time that. If it was a significant project offshore, you might find that it would be more suitable to do at certain times of the year. But of course, that's also weather dependent. So it goes in the mix, but I've not seen them make a decision based on
the environmental. Rajiv give us another question. Is there an effort to validate the actual major accident, e.g. Deepwater Horizon, how accurate the results were compared to the actual impact? So are there any literature research or anything to compare the model with what we actually saw in the environmental release for these big incidents?
Not that I'm aware of, I'm afraid. No, I couldn't really comment on that. What I would say is, you did see a mixture of lethal and sublethal events, impacts from Deepwater Horizon. So there was the initial oil smothering of the sea surface, of the sediments, of the beaches. But even now, the incident of dolphins that are washed up along the coast, it's significantly higher. I mean, orders of sort of 10 magnitude still now after 10 years. So those are the sublethal effects that we didn't necessarily know at the time.
And then, just apologies if this is out of the blue, but I was watching the David Attenborough Extinction film. And in that film, he mentioned the in the 60s and 70s, there was a disposal of electrical goods within sort of landfill sites. And there's a certain chemical in the electrical components which leaks out into the water, and it's accumulating in the large sort of predators within the ocean. How are you able to build those types of things into your risk assessments? Because it may be a small amount of something that you're releasing over a long period, but it may accumulate in the sort of food chain. How do you manage those things?
So I think you're probably talking about PCBs.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
So PCBs gather in fat cells of organisms. So in fish, they gather in the liver, and then when whales, seals, dolphins, they gather in the blubber layer. That is a chronic long-term impact. There's another example. I don't know if you're familiar with tributyl tin, which is off the side of ships for decades before anybody realised. It's a consideration, but the way that we manage chemicals, again in the UK, but in the whole Asphalt area, each one has to go through a very detailed quantitative risk assessment, not dissimilar to this, before it can be used anywhere in the marine environment. Could it happen again? Yes, but I think we're better at understanding what these longer term impacts are. And unfortunately, we just have to live with these legacy issues like tributyl tin, PCBs, mercury. Yeah.
Okay. And have you seen any legislative consequences or fines for operators who fail to assess their environmental risks and manage them appropriately?
Yeah, so there was one quite recently in our news, an operator that's got a couple of assets in the North Sea. They were found £7,000 for a release to sea, which, in my opinion, I don't know the whole story of how it came to be in court or all of that, but £7,000 is not a deterrent to an operator of that size. The inventory that they lost probably cost more than that.
Right.
So at the moment, I don't think that the fine matches the crime.
No, so not like the consequences of loss of life offshore or anything like that. No. I know that when I was working offshore, there was a big focus on oil and water, because the environmental regulator was quite strict. The perception was that they had a lot of power. So have you seen that operators are quite aware of their environmental risks and actively manage them?
Yes, one of the things that I talk about quite a lot when I'm doing environmental training is this business of the prescriptive rather than a risk-based approach. The example that you mentioned there of oil and water, the limit for oil content is 30 milligrams per litre. However, within the last 5 to 6 years, everybody has realised that actually it's the production chemicals and other additives in the produced water that cause the impact to the receiving environment rather than the actual oil content. So the produced water requirements, or there's just guidelines out very recently to talk about a risk-based approach. So those people who use the most hazardous chemicals, typically corrosion inhibitors, those are the chemicals that stay in the environment for a long period of time. So yes, they are very concerned to meet the 30 milligrams per litre, but it's unfortunate that it didn't really take account of the other additives, like I say, that had a more significant impact. The other sort of slightly risk-based piece of legislation is around CO2 emissions, whereby there's a cap and trade system. So the more you reduce your CO2 emissions, there is like a financial reward for doing that. And it forces or suggests to operator that if they invest in efficient equipment, then they don't have to pay so much to emit through the production operations.
I see. So if we compare where we were maybe 20, 25 years ago, are we getting to a much better place where people are being aware of the environmental risks and understanding the hazards?
Yeah, very much so. So I was just saying to somebody the other day, when I first started out here, if I worked for an operator and I was told that I had to go offshore and do environmental training, nobody was really that interested in it. It was seen as, quite frankly, a tick box exercise. But for the last 10 years, I've been training people who work offshore independently of where I've worked. And the fact that, over 1,000 people have been through this training course in that amount of time, and the numbers don't seem to be going down. So that says to me that the kind of narrative has shifted to more of a continual improvement rather than a tick box. And the people on the training course and the people who work on the work site are very, very interested. And a bit like safety, nobody or very few people ever want to deliberately do anything to cause harm. Very often we find within the environment, they don't understand the full range of impacts. So it's always a bit of an eye-opener when we talk about how resource management affects this, about emissions and all the tiny things that they do that they don't expect to impact on their environmental performance. Maintenance has a huge impact on environmental performance, for instance, but would your average maintenance tech think that they contributed to continual improvement for the environment? No. So yes, it's definitely got much wider uptake, and it's becoming part of everyday conversations that you might otherwise have only had on safety.
Oh, that's great. And so I think it's I've seen a lot of conversations on slip, trips and falls, etc. So I think that this is an opportunity to have a synergy between improving process safety awareness, which I know has been going up also in the last 10 years, but improving process safety awareness with environmental impact awareness. So having the two come side by side so that people are talking, there's no difference between the two. It's just that consequences from one event is different to another one.
Yeah, for sure.
Have you ever had a situation where there's been special mitigations put in place as a result of an environmental risk assessment, which haven't been required to be put in place as a result of a process safety risk assessment?
Yes, so if you consider the spill response requirements of a standby vessel offshore, for instance, you don't need to have the spill dispersants and the booms to spray the spill dispersants if it's a safety event. So yes, there's a big focus, because if you consider a spill of oil to sea, the standby vessel and the dispersant actually becomes environmental critical equipment to respond to the spill. So a number of vessels that we looked at, the dispersant was out of date, and they hadn't maintained the spray booms for quite some time. So if they were called upon in the event of an emergency, they wouldn't have worked. So by making those environmentally critical, that really upped the ante on the maintenance and verification for that equipment.
Yeah, when you talk about those sort of things, I start to think about the escape to sea ladders. Those are always considered the last resort, but they're never maintained. So when you want to use them, you're not getting off.
Yeah.
You
don't want to have to be relying on that.
No, you don't. Ideally, you get you fix it before then, but if they are your last resort, when you do the onshore assessments or maybe even the offshore ones, how do you integrate with the other people that will help you respond? Because presumably the response is not going to be able to all be handled within the operator's control of influence. They may need some support from Coast Guard or firefighters or something.
Yeah, so when we're interfacing with a fire brigade, the environmental person is always there for the conversation, with the chief fire officer when he comes down and does the assessment. And what they're really concerned about, and particularly since the Buncefield disaster, is where are your significant entries kept? What can be used to tend to the fire? And the runoff is a big problem environmentally, which is probably not considered from a safety perspective, I wouldn't have thought. So if you're fighting a fire with water, a significant volume of water is used, it's used on a chemical, you're then left with potentially 2 to 3 times the original size of a contaminated runoff. So you want to know where's your inventory and what controls you've got to stop that spilling, because of course that could be a vector to spread fire.
Sorry, my camera froze there, so I just had to reset it. I had a really good post shared with me on LinkedIn this week. There was an asphalt fire at a refinery in the US, but the local fire department engaged with all of their major inventory sites to understand the risks associated with those sites. So when they had the asphalt fire, from a process safety perspective, they made sure that people stayed inside because the fumes from the fire were toxic, etc. So they stayed inside. But also when they started to fight the fire, they routed the runoff to a place where they could collect it and then process it. Because I've seen a lot of responses to incidents where the runoff just goes into the local waterway, and those sort of environmental concerns are not considered.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a thing for offshore, but certainly on onshore sites, the water runoff becomes a matter in its own right. And do you send it to the fire pond? Do you just let it go onto the nearby fields or wherever you are? But the other interesting one from onshore fires is the actual deposition from solid particles resulting from fires. So they say if they go into the atmosphere and then along and then dump on ground, a couple of miles away from the site, then that could be an off-site matter.
So
you
that's
need to
similar.
understand that when you consider fire as well.
So that's similar to what we saw with the ash cloud, just on a bit of a smaller scale. Yeah. So I have another question from the floor. Are chemical specific TQs, I'm not sure what that means, so if you don't understand that, I'll ask them, considered for the assessment? What are the regulations or standards which provide them?
So I'm familiar with the term called RQ, risk quotient. Would that be the same?
Rajiv, if you can let us know if TQs and RQs are the same. So it'll just take a moment for him to type, so we'll carry on.
So if it is the same, the risk quotient, yes, we considered that and we built it into the model. So again, just going back to the point I was making earlier, chemicals used in normal operations go through a quantitative risk assessment, considering the RQ, the dispersion, all of those things. So that information is very well known and used in the North Sea. So yes, it gets punched into that, the DREAM model. So the image on the left-hand side, the deterministic model, gets all of that safety data sheet and environmental toxicity information built into it.
So Rajiv said that's the threshold quantities. Is that the same as what you're talking about?
Threshold quantities for a lethal impact on an organism, maybe. I think the answer is yes, because we have another bunch of acronyms called PEC, PNEC, so predicted environmental concentration over predicted no environmental concentration. And we tie all of that risk quotient back to the lethal doses that we know for, a type of plankton, a plant, a shellfish, and a fish. So, yes.
So the other thing that comes to mind is when we have releases on the plant, there are sometimes trace elements of compounds which can cause, which are carcinogens for humans, etc. Those are often not considered in process safety risk assessments because they're not sufficiently high to set off the gas detection or sufficiently high to cause a fire. Is that where you guys come in as well with some of your modelling, able to monitor some of the lower concentrations across a wider area?
Well, I mean, we are concerned with those type of gases that have a high greenhouse gas potential, and so more than CO2. So if you think the NOx and the SOx and the volatile organics, those type of things, they probably would be modelled on a site-wide basis. But in any event, in an aspects register, which is basically your risk register for environmental risk, part of your environmental management system, those type of lower level abnormal and normal operating conditions are considered in there. And I guess that's a really great example of where maintenance and equipment management comes right into environmental risk management.
Yeah, that's right. I was thinking about we had a problem with BTEX, and because of the the way that we were structured and how close we were to communities, there was a potential that we could impact them, but it was not something that would have come up in our process safety risk assessments. It came more through an environmental type.
When you talk about local communities, increasingly because of this, big awareness of corporate social responsibility and sustainability, social impacts get rolled up into the environmental risk assessment as well. Now, certainly there's no suggestion, of an offshore spill. We don't really consider the social impact of that, but definitely on coma sites, we are very interested on where the nearest house is, where the nearest sewer is, what would be the dispersion to the local town, for instance. So yes, in one hand, the social part is very much there, but not in a major event. I never can remember the word of gases coming out of valves like you just described.
Oh, right, yeah. No, well, ours was coming out the flare, which is why it was, that's why it could travel far. But yeah, the fugitive emissions, I think, is the word you're looking for.
That's it.
There was one other program that I've watched recently, which was an incident in America. Have you heard of the the Tefal incident. I think the movie's called Dark Waters.
No, I haven't seen that.
And it's DuPont, I think. So what happened in that area was they were making Teflon. They were making Teflon coated pans. Everything was Teflon, nothing sticks, right? But they hadn't really considered the environmental impact of Teflon very well. And also it had a major impact on the local community, higher cancer rates, lower life expectancy. Almost all the cattle in the area died. It was really quite significant. And there was a lot of, it took a very long time for the people living in that area to actually be able to get justice from the manufacturer, because it seemed like the law was on the manufacturer's side rather than on their side. I haven't heard of those type of big long-term events in the UK. Is there something different about the way we regulate emissions in the UK that means that we haven't seen those things, or is it just luck?
Well, obviously a good dose of luck, but before you start any major development like a factory manufacturing installation like that, you do have to go through an environmental impact assessment, and increasingly that's an ESHA, so an environmental and social impact assessment.
Okay.
That again would consider the local population, who of course become a receptor. You would do soil samples. I'm not working on any COMA sites at the moment, but a lot of PPC regulated sites. We have to have boreholes around the site perimeter, and then take the borehole sample every 1 year, 2 years, depending on the perceived risk. And we would know very quickly if there was anything in the water table that was leaching into the soil. So in your environmental impact assessment, you identify what the major environmental issues would be, and then of course you engineer them out before you actually start the operation. So it is unlikely, with the robustness of the planning process here and in a lot of other places, that could happen. I would say a huge part of that as well is stakeholder engagement. So they spend an awful lot of time, depending on the scale of the development, of course, talking to, engaging with local regulators, interest groups, so people who are interested in birds, if it's a marine problem, a marine development, fish, seals, but like I say, also the local population, so they are aware of everything from the earliest stage.
So I think the problem was that the chemical that they were using wasn't regulated, and when they asked to put a threshold on how much was safe, they actually asked the manufacturer to put their own threshold, which they put as higher than the value that they had in the water around the plant. So therefore they said, well, it's within the legal threshold, so therefore there's nothing wrong here. But actually they hadn't looked at the, like you've said, the actual consequences of the different thresholds. I think we find a lot, in the process safety space, we find a lot of difference between the UK and the US, because the US is still very much compliance-based framework, whereas the UK is more in a risk-based framework. So we have to take ownership of our risks. I assume that could be similar in the environmental space.
I mean, in my experience, a lot of countries, certainly that I've worked around the world, have been based from an environmental perspective on the pollution prevention and control requirements that we have in the UK. I mean, that isn't COMA, but it's the tier down from a COMA site for onshore. So, our regulation does seem to inspire quite a lot of other countries. And of course, following the Deepwater Horizon incident, the American safety cases had a lot of obscene content, so they kind of were aware of the move toward a risk-based approach, but they did regulate for the requirement for assent. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think they're still struggling to move them over to a risk-based approach, because it's there's quite a lot of resistance, perceived resistance to.
Well, 2011, 2012, that my colleagues were, quite frankly, selling SEMS as a new thing, because we had a lot of interest in the Gulf of Mexico. All of our SEMS models were based on HSG 65, ISO 14001, 9001. So yeah.
So a lot of the good practice is being spread through good tools. Yeah. Okay, well, we don't have any more questions. Jill, is there anything that maybe we should have asked that we haven't asked about how environmental major incidents tie in with process safety planning, workshops, etc.?
No, I would just say keep asking the questions, and keep trying to find solid answers on things. Like I say, a lot of process safety engineers, my old boss used to say, can some environmental person please just give me a yes or no answer? Because it was like, well, if it's this day, this might happen. If it's this month, that could happen. And that's not what anybody wants to hear, you know? So as I say, keep challenging them to give you a straight answer, because it's very difficult to move forward on a project when you don't have those answers. And if they're based on firm assumptions in the project plan at the beginning, then there's no reason why that can't happen. I would also say, I've kind of presented almost a gold-plated version of what can be achieved. There's no suggestion you would do that every single time.
No. So identifying when we would do that would be through something like a hazard, identifying some sort of major environmental potential, and then choosing those scenarios to put through something like this?
Well, I guess you'd want to understand, what is your kind of, a lot of this is driven right now through organizations' targets and goals for sustainability and environmental management. So very often those goals may be at a higher level to what the actual environmental impact is. And I guess I'm making the point that I did in the first or second slide, that reputational impact goes absolutely hand in hand with the environment. So from a reputation perspective, you may be taken down the road of more work that isn't justified for the actual environmental impact. So it is very much a case-by-case basis. It would depend on the visibility of a project, quite frankly, how much attention it was getting. With a strategic project, so for instance, a big decommissioning project in the North Sea will get global attention. Nothing can go wrong on a job like that. A pipeline that goes across all of Europe, it cannot happen. So
no, not after the last time, where they still talk about green. Was it Greenpeace boarding? Yeah.
Yes, it was Greenpeace. Now, the thing about that is it was all about the communication of environmental risk to the public.
And
it's about engagement, stakeholder engagement.
So I've also seen it's quite difficult for leaders to discuss process safety issues very clearly with the public, or even with their own workers who are actually working with the risk. How much easier, or is it easier to discuss environmental risk with the public and the workers?
Well, I have to say most of my working time is spent talking to the workforce about these things. They're very interested, but there is a lot of misconceptions, and I guess that's a very similar approach from the public. Nobody wants to pull the wool over anybody's eyes here. You just have to be, truthful and open, as honest as possible. But this is where the scientific approach comes into it, because you're able to say, look, I've spent a lot of time here. I've calculated this risk. This will only happen once every 1,700 years. Of course, the public are very emotive. They would be more concerned at the loss of one dolphin rather than, I don't know, miles of plankton. You have to understand what the sweet spot of the group that you're talking to is, what the mood is at the time. It's a strange combination of kind of emotion and science in one. And the strangest people really care about environmental management that you wouldn't necessarily expect at the worksite. So I had a really nice example a couple of weeks ago of a big kind of roughy, toughy operative who works on an emulsion unit on one of the sites that I'm at. And he had a swallow family make a nest in his lab, and his lab's in a container. And he used to take photos of the swallows every single day and send them to me. And he was like their adoptive father. He was very sad when the chicks left. But it's little things like that that actually pull on people's heartstrings.
And so if there's something that I'm going to take away from this today and do, what is it?
It's about having a realistic approach to your risk. I think it's fair to say when we went through this process, the answer that we came back with was, yes, this is actually very, very low risk. We only remember Deepwater Horizon. An event of that scale hasn't happened in the North Sea, and we have proven that it's unlikely to anytime soon. So what I always say when I'm doing risk assessment training is the risk assessment is there as much to take things away as what it is to add in terms of control. So yeah. Stick to the facts, leave emotions behind.
Yeah, I often find that people are putting in lots and lots of safeguards for something that's quite low risk, and then the things that are high risk they're not really paying that much attention to because of their emotional attachment.
Being consequence driven or not, the regulators are very focused on consequences when we actually said, look, this is a 2,000-year event. We don't believe that the controls actually justified in this instance.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jill, for joining us. It's been a really good session, and I've learned a lot. So thank you very much from me, and thank you very much to everyone online. I've really enjoyed the questions coming through the chat box. I hope that one day in the future you can join us again, Jill. Really enjoyed the session.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.